Hi, everyone, and welcome this afternoon to the last of our webinars in the FIP Failing Incinerator Project Cohort webinar series. This has been shutting down incinerators and building zero waste futures. Today, we're going to wrap up with the third webinar, which is on using science-based and legal approaches. My name is Jessica Roth. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Plastics and Petrochemicals Program Manager for the US Canada region of GAIA, and I'll be your moderator for today. GAIA, which is the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, is a global network of more than 1,000 grassroots groups, NGOs, and individuals in over 90 countries around the world, all working together at the intersection of waste and environmental justice. The Failing Incinerators Project, or the FIP Cohort, is a core group of partners that have been fighting to shut down incinerators in environmental justice communities and set up healthier alternatives, moving towards zero waste systems that support and empower their communities. FIP wouldn't have been possible without the generous support from the Freedom Together Foundation, the Plastic Solution Fund, and the B Fund. So we'd really like to thank them before we begin today. And just one housekeeping note, Chris Tandazzo, who uses they, them pronouns, and Marcel Howard, who uses he, him pronouns, are both with GAIA and will be managing our tech support and moderating the chat. We'll have enabled the Q&A function and encourage folks to add questions there or in the chat, and we'll hold space for all of that at the end. To recap the series, in the first webinar, we heard from the FIP cohort frontline members and learned about kicking incinerators out of communities as a matter of building local power through grassroots organizing. The second webinar then showed us what happens after an incinerator shuts down, the process of decommissioning incinerators, and the amazing things that former incinerator host communities have been working on to replace those toxic extractive incinerator industry. In the third and final webinar of the series, we're going to hear from FIP cohort members and allies about some specific tools that have helped local efforts and campaigns to shut down incinerators, these science-based and legal approaches. These tools provide critical support to both shut down incinerators and, in their place, to build community-based regenerative systems that center and advance local grassroots solutions. We'll also hear about the importance of building relationships and trust with communities in order to ensure an equitable and collaborative approach. This FIP cohort has had incredible successes. Through strategic, collaborative, grassroots organizing and other work across the GAIA network and beyond, they've pushed 3 of the 6 incinerators targeted by the project to close, and that's in Michigan, California, and Oregon. And the HERC in Minnesota is on its way to closing. Not only do these wins improve the lives and health of the communities in which these incinerators are located, they also bolster and support anti-incineration work across the country and even around the world. By not accepting toxic waste systems as inevitable, these communities drive progress more broadly in climate and environmental justice and zero waste. So some of you may know that this year is GAIA's 25th anniversary. Since beginning, GAIA has grown into a powerful global network, supporting and working with grassroots organizations around the world, strengthening local movements and driving systemic change. It's precisely this kind of relationship building and solidarity work that will help us move through this time of escalating climate threats to build a sustainable and just future for all. We're committed to continuing this work to shut down more incinerators and to promote zero waste solutions globally. So, as I said, today we're going to hear from 2 cohort members and 2 ally groups who have provided resources in these fights. And we recognize that some people and organizations come in with more privilege, which may also come with some blind spots. So we hope for accountability and to be called in when these kinds of things happen. I also want to acknowledge that there's an added complication of this, quote, science and legal panel, because we don't want to be enshrining that ivory tower of higher education or reifying these systems and the white supremacy that they're rooted in. We always want to think and work in a way that puts all kinds of expertise on a level playing field and to center and highlight the expertise of the people on the ground, the frontline, fence line, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and economically disadvantaged communities, and to have their experiences guiding the science, legal, medical, and any other, quote, experts. So first today, we have Nick Leonard. Since becoming the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center's executive director in 2018, Nick has pushed the organization to become a leader in Michigan's robust environmental justice movement by providing legal representation to frontline communities across the state. Nick supervises the center's attorneys and coordinates the organization's legal strategies. He also regularly represents the center's clients on a wide variety of issues. Nick, it's all yours.
Thank you. Hey, everybody, it's great to be here. And it's great to talk about my work and the work of our organization in closing the Detroit incinerator for a lot of reasons. One of which is it was a successful campaign. The other of which it was sort of, I think, a really illustrative model of how lawyers can effectively work with communities. So I'm going to talk a lot about that. But also on a personal level, like the Detroit incinerator became something of an obsession for me because I grew up in the Detroit area. So it was in the smokestack for the incinerator, for those of you that are from here, is kind of like just this omnipresent force in my life from childhood to sort of college to law school, and then eventually as a lawyer, passed by it like every day on the way to work. And so it was just sort of just this big personal challenge that me and other members in our community took up to basically close this incinerator. And so I'm really happy to just kind of share a bit about that work with you all today. So I work at the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. We're a Detroit-based environmental law nonprofit that really just seeks to kind of represent individuals that are impacted by environmental justice issues throughout the state of Michigan. And so one of the ways we did that was through participating in the Breathe Free Detroit campaign, which had a pretty simple objective of closing the Detroit solid waste incinerator. Just a brief history, just to lead into sort of the foundation of that coalition and that campaign. So the Detroit incinerator was constructed in 1986, so the same year that I was born. It was initially owned and operated by the city of Detroit. And the idea was like it would basically serve as this public sort of resource, this way that Detroit could insulate itself from rising landfill costs. Unfortunately, within 5 years, the facility is sold to a private company, eventually purchased in 2010 by Detroit Renewable Power. And then sort of in 2017 is really the jumping off point for the Breathe Free Detroit coalition, because it was at that point that Michigan announced that they were going to fine the owners of the facility roughly $150,000 for 6 violations of air emissions limits. And really that's the kind of time that we all started to kind of coalesce as a coalition. And really it was just sort of this loose organization at first of different organizations focused on environmental justice, different residents that really came together around sort of that enforcement action to try to figure out, you know, precisely what we were going to do about this. And we eventually developed a pretty simple goal of getting the incinerator to close within 5 years. That within 5 years was really like my personal goal. Like as a coalition, we had just set sort of close the incinerator at a date uncertain. And I'll talk about why I set a personal goal of 5 years, but really, you know, we were focused around a number of different activities. Primarily, the coalition was non-lawyers. I was the only lawyer that was participating. And so we gravitated towards a lot of community education and engagement work, a lot of community and political organizing work. And then I was really just sort of the legal advocacy arm of trying to piece things together on that front. But these pictures here are just from one of the community engagement events that we had. We did a lot of like really positive sort of like just community parties, more or less, where people would come together and just talk about the different things that were going on in their life and just how the incinerator was impacting them. We did a lot of political organizing as well, which I'll get into. My job as the lawyer of the group was really to identify the pressure points for getting the incinerator to close. And one of the unique things that I found in our work on the incinerator, which was still privately owned, but there was just a ton of public touch points, like a ton of touch points with different public entities. And that was really important because it made getting records about how the facility was operating pretty easy through a variety of Freedom of Information Act requests. And so we were able to kind of get a picture of garbage stream to the facility through their contracts, some details on real estate ownership at the facility, some details on steam sales, and then a lot of air quality emissions violations. All of that was eventually distilled into the Detroit Incinerator Primer, which was essentially like a report that distilled all of the legal research that I was able to do. And really, at the end of the day, I was just trying to figure out, like, how is this facility operating? Where is it getting its money? Where is it having issues? That kind of thing, to try to inform our legal advocacy strategy, try to really assess what are the best points of leverage that we have for convincing this facility to close. So I'll start with garbage disposal, but I'll walk through each of those different kind of points of operation. So on the garbage disposal front, the facility was regularly disposing nearly 1 million tons of garbage every year. And one of the unique things that we found was roughly 25% of that garbage is coming from the city of Detroit. The rest is coming from out of state and different places, Canada, other states. And we also knew that Detroit's contract was set to expire in 2021. So that came kind of a flashpoint, like, oh, if we can get City of Detroit to commit to not renewing that contract, that could go a long way to closing the facility. But we also found some key public messaging points, like one of which was Detroit actually paid more to send their trash to the incinerator than neighboring, more affluent suburbs like the Grosse Pointe and places like that. And so it was, once again, just kind of a key messaging point to say, like, Detroit is subsidizing other communities to burn their trash here, to pollute in our community, which was really key in terms of just turning the political tides against the facility long term. We also took a look at steam sales and found that the facility served approximately 85 customers in the downtown Detroit area. And those customers were a lot of universities, hospitals, local governments. So a lot of, basically entities that could be susceptible to public pressure. And we also found out that the owners of the facility also owned natural gas boilers downtown that were capable of meeting those steam needs, which is what's going to be an important point in a little bit. And we also learned that the city of Detroit actually owned the land on which the incinerator sat, and it leased that land to Detroit Renewable Power. And that lease included a clause that allowed the city to terminate that contract if the owner violated any environmental laws. And notably, we found that they were violating environmental laws quite frequently. The facility had exceeded air emissions limits over 750 times in the previous 5 years, and that's the 2013 to 2017 span. Most of those were violations of a 1-hour carbon monoxide emissions limit. They had violated that nearly 750 times in and of itself. And so all that is to say, like, we had a few sort of ideas here. Number one, we knew that the main source of revenue for the company was through steam sales. And so we knew that was kind of like their financial bread and butter. We also knew that they had existing equipment, the gas boilers, that were capable of generating enough steam to meet that demand. And then through all of that research, we were able to identify several points of leverage from both a legal and non-legal perspective that we could sort of pursue to compel the facility to close. We could pursue this legal remedy of suing the company in federal court over air emissions violations. But we also knew, like, if we could convince the city to terminate the lease, convince the city to cancel the waste contracts, convince local institutions to cancel the steam purchase contracts, that could also go a really long way to kind of like just influencing the company's bottom line, getting them to close the facility. I'll note, like, all of this stuff is just things that we got through public information requests that, don't really require a law degree in and of themselves. And so, like, just getting a picture for what the facility is doing, how they're operating, was really informative for our Breathe Free Detroit campaign and really informed the different sort of strategies that we employed. And really what we did that I think was different, because I remember when we started the campaign, everybody was like, this isn't going to work. People have been trying to close this facility for a long time. But we really focused on a lot of community education events, just getting people aware of the problems the facility was having. participating in local organizing, particularly targeting local government officials like the mayor, city council members, and getting them to know like this is an issue that you should be paying attention to, and hosting things like postcard writing campaigns where residents would send postcards to the mayor, stuff like that. And a lot of it wasn't sort of, the results weren't immediately apparent. Like I remember at this event in front of City Hall, we delivered a bunch of petitions to the mayor at the end, and he was basically like, what are you bothering me about this? You should go complain to your state environmental department. And so, they were seemingly brushing us off. And then in the meantime, we're also building our Clean Air Act laws. And eventually, the Clean Air Act citizen suit was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. The company announced that it would close the incinerator just days before our notice period ended for announcing our citizen suit. And you'll notice here, which I think is important, like below is a statement from the mayor of Detroit, where he claimed to have been working behind the scenes to get the incinerator shut down for a long time. I can promise you that's not true. I was deeply ingrained in that work for a long time. And like I said, it wasn't sort of the message that he was putting out, but all of that sort of messaging work at the front end basically made him take a strong position against incineration once everything was done, which, in a certain way is valuable, and in a certain way led to the facility eventually being demolished. And so, I think we had taken this sort of like multi-pronged organizing and legal advocacy approach that really worked for us. We were also looking at things like policy advocacy that we just didn't really have to get to because we had enough points of leverage before we even got there. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jessica, and thanks for giving me some space and time today.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. And as a reminder, as folks are having any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat or to the Q&A. Either one of those will work for later. And next we'll hear from a FIP cohort member, Maggie Schuppert. Maggie's the director of strategic initiative at CURE, a Minnesota-based rural advocacy organization. She brings her commitment to environmental rights, justice, and accountability to her work, helping to build CURE's capacity for strategic communications, campaigns, and legal advocacy. When she is not giving corporations and state agencies a hard time, she can be found in far northern Minnesota trying her hand at cold climate gardening and DIY improvement. Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, Jessica, and everyone. As Jessica said, my name is Maggie. I'm with an organization called CURE in Minnesota. A little more about CURE. As Jessica said, we are obviously Minnesota-based, and we are also a rural community-focused organization that works to protect and restore resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of people who care about them. And so on a day-to-day basis, what that means is that we work on issues of climate and energy and the environment, but always with a focus on rural community perspectives and making sure that rural communities are part of this conversation that we're having around climate and energy and our other systems. Next slide, please. Well, first off, a little apologies in advance. Other than this slide, I usually try to make my presentations more visually appealing than this one might be, but it's a new one for me, so I didn't really have the chance to do that, but I've seen the other presentations and they all really pop visually, but just sort of wanted to acknowledge that. But moving on, a little more about, before I get to the topic of hand, sort of CURE's work around incineration. As Jessica said, we are a member of GAIA's Failing Incinerator Project. We came into this work around, I believe, 2023, which is relatively recent, I think, compared to a lot of the folks who have been working on this stuff and building campaigns for years. And we really came into this work through our partnership with the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table, which is a member of the FIP cohort and has presented previously, I believe, in the first webinar. And we really came into this work to work in partnership and allyship with them to build on their successful movement building around their campaign against the HERC in Minneapolis. Because as you'll see from this map here, number 4 is the HERC, and that is the Twin Cities. A little known fact is that Minnesota has is the state with the 3rd largest number of incinerators, and by and large, other than the HERC, they are all located outside the Twin Cities in either smaller cities or rural places, and so. Both, as I said, to sort of really leverage the power and the attention that the campaign around the HERC has built to sort of combat or to bring more attention to Minnesota's over-reliance on incineration in general, and also to try to help that campaign in terms of how often the rural-urban divide, I think in Minnesota and maybe a lot of other places, is often used as a barrier to making progressive change, especially around issues of the environment and environmental justice. So that's really how we came into this work, but acknowledging that this is, we are still in the early stages in many respects. And so, and I'll get to that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So to the topic of hand. Again, a little bit more about CURE. We're a small organization, a small rurally based organization. We have about 12 staff now. That's a lot larger than we were even 2 years ago. But we do have 2 lawyers on staff, which I think is probably somewhat unique. And that is, I think, both because of its a recognition of our perspective as an organization, and certainly my perspective as a non-lawyer. Worth sort of mentioning that I am not one of those 2 lawyers, but I am someone who's been working in the legal advocacy sphere for, frighteningly enough, approaching 2 decades. So really sort of recognizing the importance of some of these this legal tactics in terms of incorporating that into our campaigns, but also an acknowledgement of the fact as a small, rurally based Midwestern organization, if we want to have that kind of capacity and ability, we probably have to bring it ourselves. And so just sort of acknowledging that sometimes, as Jessica acknowledged, that there can be barriers to being able to wield the power of law. And sort of acknowledging that is, I think, a challenge that community-based environmental justice and also another social change organizations sometimes face, and is something as a movement we probably need to do more to address. So what I'm sharing today is sort of, as I said, my perspective as a non-lawyer who's been using this work. And I refer to the work that we do. I use the term legal mobilization. I think you'll hear other sorts of forms of when talking about sort of using the law and legal forums in the context of social change. You sometimes hear legal advocacy. You also sometimes hear things like movement lawyering, which is, I think, the pinnacle of that kind of work. I refer to what we do and use as legal mobilization, which is the strategic use of law by individuals and groups to advance justice and change objectives. It's using legal systems and norms and discourse to influence policy, culture, and behavior. So it's the strategic use of law and the legal system to advance social and environmental justice, aims to influence policy and behavior. And also, it's not just about litigation, although litigation is important. But we actually, as an organization, even with 2 lawyers on staff, we more often than not are not using litigation tactics, although I'll say a little bit more about that. But next slide, please. So the work that we do is really what's known, we work in the administrative law space by and large, and use what's called administrative advocacy, which involves influencing the rules and the rules that government agencies use to implement laws. So after law is created, after policy is created through the legislature, then that law then needs to be implemented by government agencies, whether that be at the state or local or federal level. And I think, right, this is something that folks that engage in sort of environmental justice campaigns learn very quickly. It might be that I am sort of speaking to folks here who are attending today that are like, yes, of course, that is obviously where we end up working, which is at the agency level. But I think it's worth naming that in sort of this context, just to provide the framework and the understanding about these sort of different forums, and the fact that agencies are where a lot of these decisions are made about our environment and about facilities and about pollution and who experiences pollution. And so engaging at that level is something that just sort of, as I said, you quickly learn that that is where a lot of these conversations and a lot of these fights are going to happen. So what does that look like? It's about demanding enforcement of existing regulations. That's things like challenging air permits, which we have done for a couple of facilities, and worth noting, we largely work at the state level in Minnesota. So that would be sort of working, challenging our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency when they're going to renew a permit, an air quality permit for a facility. So bringing challenges to that. It is also about representing ourselves or other parties in regulatory and administrative hearings and processes. So for instance, we have been working to, again, challenge the extension of 2 facilities here in Minnesota that are operated by Xcel, which is our largest utility, through their integrated resource planning process. And so it's a very sort of, technical and wonky and complicated process. And it is also where that utility and our state agencies are going to decide whether these facilities get to continue operating for an additional 10 to 12 years past when they were originally supposed to be retired. But making sure that our voices are there, and we submitted some joint comments along with the environmental justice table, as well as some community groups from the area, from the impacted areas and communities, to engage in that process as well. And then another form of administrative advocacy is creating the rules or regulations for implementing laws. So as I said, after you pass it, you have to implement a law. And I think advocacy groups have become very comfortable with their legislative processes, but the implementation process is often where, broadly speaking, attention often falls away. And it is where, even after maybe you passed what seemed like a very strong law, if you are not continuing to keep your eye on that implementation process, you could very easily see, when it comes to how that law is implemented and enforced, see it weakened. And so keeping the ability to stay engaged after sort of the sexy and exciting part of passing a law, I think, is actually really critical. And so, with regards to incineration, we've been doing that in a couple of different places. I believe, on the when the EJ table presented, Crystal talked a little bit about there in our engagement around the clean energy standard, where currently incineration is considered still, like a lot of states, renewable energy and also potentially carbon-free energy. The EJ table has had great success in getting exemption for the HERC from that law, but that still leaves incineration in general. So any other current or new facilities will be considered both renewable and potentially carbon-free energy. And so we've been fighting that work there. Also engaging on cumulative impacts law, which I think a lot of folks in the FIP space and probably on this call have engaged in fighting for new cumulative impacts assessments law. But making sure that that is actually implemented in a way that responds to community concerns about the kind of pollution and harms that they are actually experiencing is really critical to making sure that those laws have the impact that they were intended to have. Next slide. So thanks for bearing with all of that. And I think a really valid question is like, why spend that time there in those kinds of settings, given the barriers. And so I think, it's recognizing that this kind of work, using these kind of legal tactics and using these regulatory spaces can provide a leverage point to do a number of things. There are spaces where you can demand public participation and democratic processes, fighting for public meetings and hearings on behalf and in partnership with affected communities, fighting for transparency, generating, it can be an opportunity, the regulatory process, to generate awareness and bring publicity. It provides a forum for community voices to be heard potentially. And it is also a space for creating a record where, documenting community concerns and community generated evidence as to the concerns and the harm that they are experiencing is really important, as is potentially getting agencies to put in a formal and recorded way some of their justifications for the decisions that they make. We have had that experience in challenging an air permit, or challenging a couple of air permits. The Pollution Control Agency has denied those challenges, but in the process, they have also said some, to be honest, fairly shocking things in terms of how they consider environmental justice concerns and how they rank environmental justice communities. And I think having that on the record in a public space is important in its own right, and also potentially can serve as the basis for future legal action, including litigation. So we are not currently engaged in litigation, but as Nick noted, it can be a really powerful tactic, and even just the threat of litigation, honestly, can do a lot of power. And then finally, ultimately, regulatory processes and regulatory agencies are sites where great power is wielded. Industry, incinerator industry, other polluting industries recognize this, which is why they spend lots and lots of money to bring lawyers and capacity to those kind of spaces to influence the laws and how they are implemented and enforced. And so it is really important for us to be able to show up in those kind of spaces as well to counter that. So this is my final slide, but just a couple concluding thoughts. All of that said, I think it is also important to recognize the limitation of using the law to create change. Our legal institution, including especially in the United States, is not an agent in change. It's a static thing. And so sort of relying on the law in and of itself to create change is something that needs to be thought about critically. In addition to the fact that environmental law itself, that's sort of a general sort of statement on using the law to create social change, but environmental law, when our most formative environmental laws were being created in the 60s and 70s, they did great good and progress in terms of overall environmental protection, but they, for various reasons, did not really deal with the distributive aspects of pollution and harm. And I think you have seen that over time in terms of how they've implemented, and also how that has influenced the mainstream environmental movement. And so I think that also speaks to the real importance of the work that we have seen environmental justice and community impacted community organizations do in terms of, for instance, bringing in cumulative impacts as part of the conversation and making sure that that is integrated into environmental law, or as Nick pointed to, using civil rights actions and merging that with environmental law has been really important in terms of making that shift. But at the end of the day, if your legal tactics aren't grounded in community and building community power, then you are unlikely to see the wins that you want to see. And I will say that that is, certainly something that we are keeping in mind, being in the early stages of our work to fight a number of incineration facilities. I definitely want to acknowledge that we are sort of, using this regulatory process. I think it has been really important in terms of some of these things on the slides, in terms of bringing transparency to the process, creating awareness, being able to use these processes to raise concerns and bring some information to communities. But we still have a road to, more of the road to walk down in terms of really making sure that our legal strategy is grounded in what the community wants, and the power that the community can bring to this work. So that is my concluding thoughts. Thanks for giving me the space. And I'm excited, and I hope this provided sort of a framework for the ongoing sort of case studies of successful campaigns that I think some of the other speakers are going to be talking about.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Up next, we have Byron Chan, who is a senior attorney in Earth Justice's Community Partnerships Program, where he works with communities to fight for a safe, just, and healthy environment. Byron received his JD from NYU School of Law and his BA in History and Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California, Berkeley.
Hi, everyone. I think my presentation, so this is my presentation. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I wanted to spend some time today talking about a campaign that I had the privilege of working on to shut down California's last incinerators. Next slide, please. So this is the SARA report, and I wanted to start my presentation by talking about the SARA report because I think it provides a really important background for incinerators and in California and the fight against incinerators in California. So the SARA report is, this is the cover page of the report, and it's known as the SARA report because it was published by a Los Angeles consulting firm known as Searle Associates. And it was published in 1984, and it was produced for the California Waste Management Board, which is the predecessor of California's solid waste agency. So this was a report produced for our government agency here in California. And as you can see, the report has a very illuminating title. It's called Political Difficulties Facing Waste to Energy Conversion Siting. And as the title indicates, the report, it describes where public and private actors should site incinerators to avoid political opposition from communities. And basically, the report, it describes different characteristics of communities that public and private actors should target or avoid when siting incinerators. Next slide, please. So this is basically a summary of the characteristics of communities, the demographic characteristics that came from the report. So on the left, under the column least likely to resist, the report outlined different characteristics of communities who are least likely to resist the siting of incinerators in their neighborhoods. And on the right, you have the characteristics of communities that are most likely to resist. And as you can see from some of these demographic characteristics, least likely to resist communities, for example, are low-income communities with a high school or less education, rural communities, Catholic communities. It's just steeped in complete falsities, basically. But this is what the report was promoting. And then if you look at the communities on the right, most likely to resist, you're talking about college-educated communities, middle and upper income communities, and urban communities as well. So the conclusion of the report is that for public and private actors, if they wanted to site an incinerator, they should site it in the communities that resemble those on the left, the least likely to resist, and avoid the communities on the right that are most likely to resist. And yeah, unsurprisingly, it's basically saying site incinerators in low-income communities and communities of color. So California agencies, they deny ever relying on the SARA report in their siting decisions, but I think that the influence of the SARA report is very clear. So the report came out in 1984, and then when we're looking at the last 3 incinerators that existed in California, those were ones in Commerce, Long Beach, and Stanislaus County. Those incinerators started operating just a few years after the SARA report was published. And each of those incinerators are sited in communities that have many of the features described in the report for communities that are least likely to resist. So I wanted to start out with the SARA report just to provide a backdrop for incinerators in California. Ultimately, that backdrop is not unique to incinerators, right? So harmful facilities like incinerators are systematically placed in low-income communities and communities of color. But the report, it makes that practice explicit in the incinerator space in California. So turning now to the campaign that I had the privilege of working on to shut down California's last 2 incinerators. So when I started working on this issue, there were 2 remaining incinerators in California. So there was the Southeast Resource Recovery Facility, which goes by the name SURF, and that was in Long Beach. And then there was the Covanta Stanislaus incinerator in Stanislaus County. So I have a picture of that on the next slide. So that's the Covanta Stanislaus incinerator. So those were the last 2 incinerators, and there were incredible advocates already working to hold these incinerators accountable. So ECR Communities for Environmental Justice was focusing on SURF, and Valley Improvement Project was working on Covanta Stanislaus. And in 2021, around 2021, Whitney Amaya at ECR Communities for Environmental Justice, she reached out to me and my colleagues at Earth Justice. So my colleagues included Oscar Espino-Padron and Erica Martinez. And Whitney reached out to discuss the harms from SURF and its impacts on its nearby residents from the odor and ash from the facility. And I've included some pictures of SURF here for context, just to give you an idea of its impacts and what the facility was like. So on the next slide, please. So these are all pictures that inspectors from CalRecycle took of SURF. So CalRecycle is our state solid waste agency. So in this picture, you can see all of the trash that's piled up at SURF before the trash is incinerated. And SURF, it processed around 500,000 tons of waste annually and produced about 150,000 tons of ash every year. So in the next picture, you can see that big pile is ash from SURF. And when you talk to incinerators or how incinerators should be operating, is that ash is so dangerous, it really needs to be contained. But as you can see here, the ash is just exposed to the outdoors. So that's really harmful and troubling and a violation of the facility's permit and the law. And in the next picture, you can actually see the ash that's covering the roads at SURF. So that's the feet of the inspector who took the picture. And the inspector basically described how there was so much ash on the roads of the facility that it was clogging the drains. So that's all ash right there. So we spent time investigating SURF, and these pictures are from agency inspections. And it was clear that the facility was causing harm to the environment and to the surrounding community. But despite all of that, there was no clear legal hook to hold the facility accountable for all of its harms. And instead, really what we found was that the law allowed SURF to commit these harms without any real repercussions. The law really gave SURF a lot of chances to improve its behavior. And then there was no real follow-up on whether that behavior had really improved or not. So that was really frustrating, unfortunately not surprising. And while our research didn't provide a legal way to hold SURF accountable, we did learn a lot about SURF in the process of researching its operations. And something particularly interesting that we learned about SURF's operations was that SURF and Covanta Stanislaus as well, so both incinerators in California, were really operating in really precarious economic situations. They were not very profitable, and they were often relying on public money to continue to operate. And in addition to that, they were relying on really high tipping fees to make money. And a tipping fee, it's the cost that the incinerator was charging folks to dump waste at the incinerator. So tipping fees at SURF and also at Covanta Stanislaus were much higher than tipping fees at landfills, for example. But despite that higher tipping fee, you would think that folks who are dumping their waste would go to either a landfill or an incinerator really focused on the cheapest tipping fee, right? So we were surprised that jurisdictions and folks were continuing to send their waste to SURF and Covanta Stanislaus despite their higher tipping fees. And we really learned, based off that question of why that was happening, we learned that jurisdictions throughout California were sending their waste to be burned at these incinerators because they could claim a diversion credit for doing so. So basically, in California, jurisdictions are required to divert 50% of their waste from landfills. And the idea of that requirement is to require jurisdictions to move away from landfills and more towards source reduction or recycling and reuse. But what we found is the law allowed jurisdictions to count any trash that they sent to the incinerators towards their 50% diversion requirement. So basically, jurisdictions could burn their trash at the incinerators and then claim a diversion credit as if they were recycling the trash. And because of that diversion credit, of the state's 419 jurisdictions, what we found was that 249 of those jurisdictions, so over more than half of them, were sending their trash to be burned at SURF and Covanta Stanislaus to claim the diversion credit. So basically what that meant was the diversion credit was making SURF and Covanta Stanislaus financially viable. And we wanted to highlight the harm that that credit was causing. So we ultimately, what we decided to do was we worked with ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. We worked with Valley Improvement Projects and also Californians Against Waste to publish a report outlining the story of SURF and Covanta Stanislaus, the harms that they were causing, and also tell the story about how this diversion credit was keeping these facilities afloat. So on the next slide, you'll see the cover page of that report. And we titled that report Vestiges of Environmental Racism, because as I was describing with the Sarah report, these incinerators were really rooted in environmental racism and the harm that they were continuing to cause, and their ability to continue to exist was again based in environmental racism. So this report and our research, it ultimately led to a campaign to pass a bill in California that would remove the diversion credit for incinerators. So on the next slide, you'll see that this bill basically became AB or Assembly Bill 1857. So in 2022, again, with our partners, ECR Communities for Environmental Justice, Valley Improvement Projects, and Californians Against Waste, we sponsored Assembly Bill 1857 by Cristina Garcia. And the bill did a really simple thing. It removed the diversion credit for incinerators by redefining incineration as disposal. So the message was clear that burning trash is not recycling. And jurisdictions who send their trash to be burned at the incinerators can no longer claim a diversion credit for doing so. So really our thinking was that by eliminating the diversion credit, we would be removing the most significant incentive for jurisdictions to send their waste to the incinerators to be burned. And without that diversion credit, SURF and Covanta Stanislaus would no longer be financially viable. So AB 1857, it successfully passed both houses of the legislature, and Governor Newsom signed the bill in 2022, and it went into effect in 2023. And very soon after, both SURF and Covanta Stanislaus, they reported significant reductions in the amount of waste that they were processing. So for example, SURF reported a reduction of nearly 50% in the amount of waste that they were receiving and burning. And that reduction meant that neither SURF nor Covanta Stanislaus could continue to operate economically. And again, within a very short time, in 2024, both SURF and Covanta Stanislaus stopped receiving waste and shut down. So that was, yeah, just incredible campaign to work on. And the result was the shutdown of California's 2 remaining incinerators. So it was really a privilege and an honor to be a part of that campaign. And I'll end with the last slide, which shows a picture of, for the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I should say this was an article about the shutdown of the Covanta Stanislaus incinerator, as you can see at the end of 2024. And then there's one more slide after this. Yeah, so I wanted to end with just this picture showing the incredible advocates who I got to work with on this campaign. And this was at a community celebration hosted by East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice following the closure of the SURF incinerator in Long Beach. So on the left, you have Erica Martinez, who is our policy advocate at Earth Justice. You have Whitney Amaya next, who is an organizer at East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. And then the 2 folks next to Whitney are Bianca Lopez and Tom as well, who are from Valley Improvement Projects and their family, who are really spearheading the fight against the Covanta Stanislaus incinerator. So these incredible advocates not only worked to shut down the incinerators, but also to create a space for community members to envision what would happen after the incinerator shut down, and what communities wanted to see in the place of those incinerators, both kind of conceptually as far as like a zero waste future, but also at the physical sites of the incinerators, and what could replace the harm that those incinerators represented and actually incurred on the communities surrounding them. So thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I really just want to give all the credit to the incredible advocates in these communities, in this picture, and the communities that supported the successful campaign.
Great. Thank you so much, Byron. For our last speaker, we have Carlos Sanchez, who is a youth leader and South Baltimore resident, focusing on citywide outreach and education, connecting residents to create community-owned development in Baltimore. Carlos acted on lessons from EJ leaders by helping to develop Baltimore's first citywide zero waste plan and advocating for new funding for permanently affordable community-owned development. Now, Carlos continues to advance environmental justice through research and action while expanding South Baltimore Community Land Trust's outreach to the next generation of youth leaders. So now we'll hear from our final FIP cohort speaker.
Thank you, and hi everyone. Thank you all for having me here today to share a little bit more about who we are and who I am and how we're using science and legal strategies to phase out incineration. But like it was said, I grew up in South Baltimore and graduated from a local high school called Benjamin Franklin. And I got involved after learning how students who attended the same school were taking on big challenges like shutting down a proposal to build the world's largest incinerator a mile away from the school, and continuing to fight for the better of the community. And now I'm able to carry that torch and use the same and different methods to further help our communities. And the two examples that I'll be sharing with you all today is regarding two incinerators that are all both in South Baltimore, so close to each other. The one on your left is the Brusco trash incinerator that takes trash from both our city and county. And the one on your right is a medical waste incinerator, which is the largest in the nation. And we can go on to the next slide, please. So, wanted to give a little bit more information about South Baltimore. And so, our communities alongside the two incinerators that I just mentioned are also surrounded by over 100 sources of pollution. And in this kind of setting, bad actors can dodge accountability by, generally pointing the fingers to each other. And, that's why it's really important to use science and legal ways to address these community issues. And the best way we've seen that to use that is having community-led research and that are able to turn that research into action. And here are some of the examples of questions and concerns that came from residents that are related directly to many of these polluting facilities marked on the map, and including the incinerators and as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the research method that we use is called COMAR, and which stands for something really very important, which is community-owned and managed research. And the key points that are in COMAR is always starts with responding to a community concern or goal, right? And it doesn't just end there. Community members like myself are involved in managing the process from defining the problem to and the research question to designing how we're going to go by and how designing the research and ultimately the long term, the translation of finding into action, right? And if you can see on the left a breakdown of the concept of participation, and where a lot of it we're not even interested in because you can see that the word participation can be often abused to mean different things that are really manipulation. So with the research, we always have to be very clear about what actually defines our process and making sure that community is, involved in every step and every stage of the process. And if we can go on to the next slide, please. And, this is just what this looks like, right? A few pictures of myself and fellow youth leaders, as well as our academic partners doing some work around is responding some community concerns that we saw earlier about the dark dust in our communities, right? There's dark dust in the homes, but wanted just to share like how another example how it looks like on the ground and out in the field. But the two examples that I'm going to talk about is going to go to the community managed research and legal tools. So if we go on to the next slide, please. One of the first is which is the use of low cost air monitoring trail cameras, right? So things that you can really accessible to the community, and we use this method more when it comes to the medical waste incinerator. And I'm not gonna go too much in depth with it, but some major points to know that this is the Curtis Bay Energy Medical Waste Incinerator. Sorry, always playing on the name. And it's the key points is that it's the nation's largest medical waste incinerator. Most of the waste comes from out of state, and as far as Canada, and ultimately has a long history of violations going back to past 2000. If we go into the next slide, please. And so this is just a map that we were able to create that shows visually where the waste is coming from out of state and the range and different categories on how much they're sending to the facility. And we can go to the next slide. And again, there is a long history of violations that community have been in opposition of this facility for quite some time now. But the one want to highlight is a recent one, which is really concerning and really problematic, which is this facility was actually pled guilty to 40 criminal charges and, really serious offenses where, they weren't burning the waste properly. They were purposely trying to take in more waste and just burning it not fully so that they can get more money and ultimately endangering the lives of the workers, residents, and communities. And proven by past experience prior on more violations prior to this, industry like this incinerator is able to pay a fine, which most of the time is nothing compared to what they make or what they made throughout that time frame, which will allow them, after paying the fine, continue to violate. And if we go into the next slide, would this be a clear example on how they're, what I'm talking about. And so a few months after, so they were fined and caught, they were charged and pled guilty in around October of 2023. And so a few months later in January, then the following year, we were just observing observing outside and near the facility, where in real time, we were able to capture and see evidence of another violation where black smoke is coming from the facility, right? And, which ultimately led us to set up, again, using community resources that are accessible to the community. We were able to purchase some low-cost trail cameras that are less than $100 that, everyday people use, like especially like if you're a hunter and you're working outdoors, you will be able to get one of these cameras and set it up. And after finding a secure location that has a clear view of the facility, we were able to observe more than one violation, dozens of violations, coming after what's the word? Sorry, back to back, and ultimately showing more violations of that this facility is committing, which ultimately was able to result in another lawsuit against the facility. And it's still ongoing right now because we are continuously capturing more footage and more evidence of black smoke events like these, and continuing sending them to state officials and governing legal resources and cases. So we can go on to the next slide. And so again, when it comes to like translating this action into research, right, we quickly are able to take that research and turn it into action when we were able to present this to our city officials and show it to the public. And this is just a breakdown of what we were able to capture in that time frame that we were monitoring and the footage that we were able to capture. And then we can go to the next slide. And the breakthrough of our research is that we were able to trigger state enforcement, like another lawsuit against this facility, but ultimately be able to connect back to that map and see what facilities or what states are sending their waste. And we were even able to get a successful divestment campaign where John Hopkins was stated publicly that they will cut their contract with this facility and they will no longer be sending their medical waste to this facility. And we go on to the next slide, please. We're also working with Christina Care in Delaware to end their contracts with the incinerator. And what was really amazing about learning from them as well is that their initiative to take to get more of a zero waste approach, and wherever tools that and leftover resources that they do have, instead of sending it to be burnt, they get able to donate it to local other hospitals and local care facilities as well. So ultimately being able to cut ties with this facility. If we go on to the next slide, please. Sorry. And so the next, moving on, is the Bresco Incinerator, which is the worst single source of air pollution in Baltimore. And this is the challenge here, is that our Baltimore waste system depends so much on incineration and landfill in frontline neighborhoods, disproportionately harming Black and brown residents, like was mentioned earlier. If we go on to the next slide, please. So the tools that we were able to use, the legal tools, is a Title VI complaint, of a civil rights complaint that we were able to file again with the EPA because we know that, over the countless times that we've been working with the communities, we've heard the city officials and to say that, yes, we're going to go to zero waste and we're going to do this, but when it comes to their budget and the actual what information they're presenting to their community, they're what's the word? They're actually say otherwise, right? And so this Title VI complaint, we were able to file it, and which was accepted, but it puts the community in a position to show what real success looks like and being able to fight for what should be in their communities, and always involving communities and what the communities is asking for to define the problem and be able to what a true resolution looks like based on community standards of equity and health. If we go on to the next slide. So alongside, well, what a lot of things that we proposed on that in that Title VI complaint, one of the things that we did talk about was the tipping, the tip fee, which requiring the city of Baltimore of the Quarantine Road landfill to increase its current tipping fee, which would be which hasn't been increased since 1993. And so it was been significantly lower than, compared to surrounding areas of, for example, like the tipping fee was $65 per ton compared to the $140 per ton in surrounding areas. And we were able to, have that increase for the Quarantine Road landfill to send trash to the incinerator into the landfill along. So we go on to the next slide. Sorry. And so if you want to learn more about it and like kind of, there's an op-ed that we were able to publish. This is just a screenshot, not just to give have people who wants to learn more and want to know more about the process and the action in that sense can feel free to read about it and learn more. But we can go on to the next slide. But I kind of went to it a little bit, but moving forward, so one of the breakthroughs was that we were able to get the mayor of Baltimore to include a landfill tip fee increase from the original $65 per ton that wasn't updated to 130 tons per year for the first time, like I said, since 1993. But our challenge now that we want to address is making sure that, because it is supposed to project up to almost $9 million a year, is making sure that that money is used on a just transition to zero waste and ending reliance on incineration and cutting ties, phasing out incineration in Baltimore. We can go on to the next slide. And so wanted to also end with a little preview of other methods that the community is using and, introducing aerial surveillance to the community to be able to really see what the incinerator is collecting and receiving, so just another that I did not put in this slides is that another success was, ending legislative that we were able to pass this year was getting trash incineration out of our RPS or being considered renewable energy. And so, which, will give them public subsidies or ratepayers dollars to continue, on top of what they make, to basically be more money for them. And in this legislative, we were able to, to remove that and, be able to, define the term what is renewable energy and making sure that trash incineration isn't renewable. And so we were able to get that that piece of legislation passed and ultimately get ending subsidies going to incinerators like Bresco. And we can go on to the next slide. So these are just previews of different aerial capture that we were able to see that are going. So like if we zoom in, we were on the last slide, we saw there was trees and what seemed to be yard waste. And here we can see furniture going into the incinerator, trees and cardboard recycling. And so just wanted to end it on that note, for giving you all a sneak peek on like different the method of that we are pursuing as well, which is aerial surveillance. But yeah, I'll end it there. And thank you all for having me here today.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Well, as we said before, we have time for some questions from the audience. I see there's a few things in the chat that I can read off, and in the Q&A. If anyone has further questions, though, please throw them up into the chat, and we can ask them of all of the speakers. So hold on. And then I just close the chat because that's how it works in my day. 1 second. So the first question here is from Gary. It says that Minnesota's over-reliance on incineration is because they're adamant to follow EPA waste management hierarchy. The EPA most recently adopted a new hierarchy for food waste, the wasted food scale, that says both landfill and incineration should be avoided. Have you raised that issue with MPCA and others to challenge their assumptions?
Yes, and yes. I think, yeah, PCA's blind, I would almost say pathological adherence to the waste hierarchy has been one of the biggest challenges, I think, you know, the EJ table and other folks fighting the HERC, and we as the larger Minnesota movement against incineration have faced. So yeah, that, you know, the work, I think, to change PCA's perspective on this is ongoing and an uphill battle, and I think is happening in a variety of foras. You know, I think there is this issue with their just inability to conceive of the fact that that there is something to do with waste other than landfilling and incineration. And so that is, of course, where sort of the larger zero waste movement work is incredibly important. You know, and you know, this is ongoing work for folks in Minnesota, for instance, and like and everyone, I think, in this space working to address, you know, organics. I think this is where, you know, Carlos talked about the fact that Maryland just got the, you know, definition of renewable energy changed. That is something, as I mentioned, we are fighting here is an incredibly important forum, because that is the, you know, part of the justification that they use for saying, well, burning is better than landfilling because at least we get this energy out of it, right? And so taking away that rationale is really important. And then I think this is also work that we are just beginning to get more into, but is sort of, you know, I think important to me as a rural community advocate, is taking seriously the harms of landfills, though. Right, like, as being really important to this conversation, and that we're moving again to not just say, like, you know, not that we're just moving the waste back and forth and that landfilling is okay, that we need to improve the standards around our landfills, we need to decrease the amount of waste, and we need to take seriously those harms as well as part of this conversation about waste and the harmful ways that we manage it. So yes, that is a challenge, Gary.
Great. Thank you for the answer. There's a bunch of different things kind of going on in the chat. I'll just quickly note that the question about having a file for photos to be shared among members, we can definitely bring that back and have a conversation about what that looks like to set up. We always at GAIA want to have as much available information that can help members with their fights and to connect them across, you know, regions and areas that are in similar fights. So that's to answer your question, Valerie. And then, hold on. Valerie's also asking Carlos about how you're getting the aerial surveillance photography done.
Yeah, what we've been using is drones that, you know, community members are able to fly out whenever there is like any concerning event going on. You know, there was a train derailment where the facility CSX had 2 trains covering up. There was a community member went out and, you know, was able to observe and kind of see what was going on. And so yeah, we've been using drones, and yeah, pretty much just drones.
Great. And then also, Sue, I just, to clarify, you were asking about an updated fact sheet or myth busting sheet on incineration, on waste to energy, or all of the above. If you could just clarify in the chat, that would be great. And then let's see, I have a question here for Nick. What was the biggest challenge in getting buy-in from the city or the city officials to end the contract with the incinerator? And how did the coalition overcome that?
Yeah, we never really got super great traction with the city, mostly because I think the biggest obstacle was they just weren't really used to playing a role in sort of like pollution prevention or pollution regulation. And so the constant source of like the constant response we got from the city officials was, you should go to the state environmental agency. They are the ones responsible for this. And we would make a point of like, no, you have a lease that you can terminate if there are violations of environmental laws, which there are. You have a contract to send waste to that facility that's going to expire in a few years. Just take a look at that. A lot of municipal buildings are purchasing steam. You can take a look at that. And so, I think all of that was helpful to sort of like slowly move them so that, they more or less took credit for things when it was done and staked out a strong position when our legal advocacy compelled the facility to close. And so it wasn't sort of wasted effort. And I think if we had more time, like the city might have come along. But the biggest obstacle is just like getting your city used to the idea of like, you have a role here, you can do something here. And that just takes a lot of time.
I think I'm going to combine two of these questions because they're kind of two sides of the same coin for Byron and Maggie, but anyone else who also has thoughts about it. People are asking about how you get folks in the legal space to be supporting community fights, and it's sort of on the flip side of that, advice for folks who want to engage in administrative and legal advocacy who are not in the legal world. And I'll just add a little of my own editorializing there, which is that I am a former lawyer and I practiced for like almost 10 years, and now I do advocacy work. And I've been challenged on the idea that that basically legal thinking is kind of antithetical to advocacy thinking, and that legal thinking has these systems that are designed, usually around permitting and allowing things to happen, whereas from the advocacy perspective, we're trying to like make there not be an assumption that something bad is going to happen, but we actually want something good to happen. And or if something bad is going to happen, you have to prove why it's not going to harm us, as opposed to how do we mitigate the harms against you, which is what the legal system is kind of framed as. And so I think the question sort of also gets to the issues of the different styles of communication and the different ways that we engage. So I think there's like so many levels that these two questions kind of get at, and would love to hear sort of anyone's thoughts on that. And this will probably be our last question because we want to respect people's time. We've got about 5 more minutes left.
I can share really quickly. Yeah, I think that it's a tough question, mainly because I went to law school and I was ready to like fight, and then you realize very quickly that the law, as you were saying, Jess, it's not on the side of the communities that I wanted to fight on behalf of, and the law is really about the status quo and maintaining property and privilege and power, basically. But what I will say is that the law is definitely not the end all be all, but it's an important tool, I think, not necessarily as the forum that you want to be in, like you want to go before a court, but I think it does offer a way, again, of Nick was talking a lot about leverage, right? Of leveraging a different point of leverage that can support community members in their fight. But again, it's just one tool, and ultimately you realize again that no win is possible without community support and being community led, and no win is sustainable without the community as well. So it's important, as we're solving problems from incinerators to any other harmful facility to use all the tools available to you, but to always be guided by the community.
Yeah, and for us, it was really important that we developed our legal strategy within the context of a broader coalition that was primarily led by non-lawyers, because I think we had identified the prospect of a lawsuit very early on in the Breathe Free Detroit campaign and held off on bringing it to do more organizing work. So I think our worst case scenario was bringing a lawsuit and not having it achieve the goals of the community, which was to get the facility closed down. And so it's one thing to have a solid legal claim. It's another thing to know that that legal claim is likely going to lead to your client's goals, which in this case was getting the facility closed down. And so we had to do a lot of work to assess just how strong our legal claim was in relation to that desired remedy of getting the facility to close. Because it's like, the last thing we want to do is like bring a lawsuit, win, and basically like more or less somehow perpetuate the operation of the facility. And so like and sort of if you're working with lawyers, you should be clear with them about how this fits in with sort of your broader work and make sure that, you know, their legal advocacy is tying in well with the other kind of strategies that you're employing.
Carlos or Maggie, you wanted to jump in?
Carlos.
Yeah, you can go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah, I'll just offer, you know, perspective as a non-lawyer, as I said. I think that's one of the sort of opportunities of administrative law. You know, I think to file a suit, you kind of have to have a legal representation. I mean, you don't have to, but you kind of do. But to engage in the administrative law sector, in the regulatory process, you don't have to be a lawyer. And I think there's you know, so that should be, you know, sort of that necessity, I think should be challenged, which is not to understate that it requires capacity and time, and often these spaces are designed not to be accessible to members of the public, so not to sort of dismiss that. But I think the other thing about sort of the administrative law space is that they might not want you to think this at agencies or like public utility commissions, is that there is a lot more space to shake things up than, say, in a courtroom. So as I said, demanding public hearing, demanding public spaces, you know, not necessarily thinking that you have to use the language and the ways of speaking that they might want you to think. So I think there's room to sort of shake off some of the expectations that sort of, you know, commissioners and agency officials and things might want to prescribe, but that yeah, I think there's the ability to push at the edges in that kind of a space that I think is really important, and you have seen used in various campaigns and various spaces to success.
Did you want to add something, Carlos, or?
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, agree with echo what everybody said, and Maggie, what you said as well, is, yeah, and this, you know, ultimately, you know, making sure that, yeah, in like some cases you would need like legal representation, but, you know, making sure making sure that community voices are always, you know, there, present at the table, and making sure that, you know, you're not settling for anything that would, you know, not be up to community standards. Because the last thing you want to do is, you know, get something and then, like, you know, be able to say, okay, yeah, this is being done, and then not, you know, but surprise, you know, this isn't what the community wanted it to be, but, you know, and you don't have to be like, I know I wasn't familiar when we were with the Title VI complaint and like the legal aspect of things, but, you know, it's something that you're still able to learn, but making sure that community voices are in that area, and then those spaces as well, like Maggie was saying.
Right. So I know we're right up at time. If folks could give me just a minute and a half of your time to close out, I just want to really thank our panelists and our allies, our partners, and especially the FIP cohort and all the participants for today. We've come to the end of this formal webinar series, but it's not the end of our work. We no longer have dedicated funding for the Failing Incinerator Project, it's true, but the fight is far from over. The need to challenge polluting incinerators and to advance true zero waste solutions in frontline communities remains as urgent as ever, if not more, and GAIA remains deeply committed to this work. We want to be clear, we're not walking away. We're actively exploring ways to continue supporting this cohort and the critical campaigns that they're leading, whether that's through strategic coordination, communication support, sharing learning spaces, or unlocking new funding pathways. We're committed to showing up for the communities in meaningful ways. And if you're tuning in today and have ideas or connections or resources that can help to keep this work alive, please reach out to us. If you're interested in supporting this cohort of powerful local leaders directly, or if you want to explore how you can engage in these campaigns or similar ones, we would love to hear from you. This is a movement built on relationships, and it's those connections that will sustain and grow this work for far beyond any single project or grant. We encourage you to stay connected with us, sign up for our newsletter, join our network, keep organizing. You'll find all the links and presentations and resources in a follow-up email you'll be getting from us. And we really want to thank you all for joining us today.